Okay, welcome everybody. It's 4 o'clock, just gone 4 o'clock. Getting everything set up here for the 24-hour newsroom. Thank you for those of you that have joined us. I've got it up in front of me. There's a few people watching. Here we go. Let's just test it out. It's an idea that I had after speaking to a colleague of mine, Julian Harrison, who said about maybe what we should do is kind of put one of your newsrooms together that we've done before for LCIL when we did a 24-hour newsroom around disability. And so 6 weeks ago, as part of the lockdown, I thought, well, actually, let's see if we can put a project together and pull it off in 6 weeks. So here we are. For 24 hours, we're going to be going through lots of different activities, lots of different conversations with people, which I'll run through now, give you a bit of an update of what we're going to be doing. The first thing I want to talk about is a little bit about the Documentary Media Centre and why we're hosting it here today. It's an independent museum, archive and library, and really the idea is to create an educational space that is the intersection between documentary media, which is film, photography, audio and new media, and solutions journalism. So rather than just focusing on the problem and this is a solution, trying to delve a little bit more into it. So we go from awareness or no awareness through some understanding through to the point where people can take some sort of micro action or think about things that they can do, not necessarily give up their jobs or leave education and go and volunteer for 7 months in Zambia and volunteer, but things that you can do, maybe some small micro actions through social media like Twitter or Facebook, people that you can support and conversations that you can have with people. Okay, so that's really what the Documentary Media Centre is about. We've got this space here now in Northampton Street, which is fantastic, in partnership with the Zinfia Trust, and thanks to Zinfia for that. And we've got this room where we do regular podcasts with Rob Watson of Decentered Media on a Tuesday, or we did do before the lockdown. We've had Reportage Club events here as well, so we've done 4 of those, and we've got a cafe space outside. And what I was thinking about really was the whole situation that we've got now where people can't come into the centre, is maybe turn the centre inside out. So what we do is we dress the space and then broadcast out what we can do, and maybe share some of the information that we've got and some of the stuff that we've got in the archive and library with people. So that's the Documentary Media Centre. Parallel Lives, which is the sort of main project that I run, covers just over 100 countries now, what we would call the global south. We don't tend not to use the term the developing world anymore, or the least developed world, the sort of global south. And it's trying to focus on finding active documentarians, whether they're using film, photography, audio or new media, to show what their lives are like, what the situations are, those global issues, try and link them with the Sustainable Development Goals, which we're working on until 2030, and help them through a community of practice, which we've coordinated from here through the Parallel Lives project, to get their content seen. Their content is invariably something that's never going to make it into the mainstream media. So if you look at the mainstream media at the top, then social media, then community media, which is people making content themselves about stuff, and then documentary media at the bottom, which is making content that you're going to share with other people, then what we're trying to do is meet the mainstream media in that social media space and get that content seen, because these people are on the front line of a lot of these global issues and are able to do things. So that's really what the Parallel Lives project's about. And you find that what runs through a lot of those countries, for those people in the global south, is the impact of white European colonial power, imperialism from the past, and in some cases still undergoing, but probably from a business point of view rather than government focus, more about big business and the exploitation of natural resources. That's really where the conflict reportage part comes in. So we're not talking about war reporting, we're not talking about war fighting. That tends to be dealt with by the mainstream media, in particular sections like photojournalism, newspaper news and stuff. This is more about conflict reportage from the point of view of an individual being able to capture what's going on. So for example, Syria at the moment, or maybe Yemen, maybe Sudan, where someone's using technology that we all take for granted to be able to create content like community media, that can then be shared through social media platforms in order to inform people about what's really going on. And what's really interesting now with the mainstream media is you find that a lot of television networks and newspapers as well will use photographs and footage once it's been verified as part of their mainstream media reports. So I think it's really important that we look at what we can do to support active documentarians and people that are working with community media around the world to be able to share that kind of information. Okay. So that's really where the Parallel Lives project comes in and where it intersects with the Conflict Reportage Archive, because Dot Media Centre hosts both the Women's Research Centre, which is a new project in partnership with Zinfia, and also my own existing Conflict Reportage Archive, if you like, which is again film, photography, audio, new media, and particular books. Okay, so what we're going to do, and the reason why we picked this date, is tomorrow, the 3rd of May, is World Press Freedom Day 2020, and so a lot of the stuff that we do tomorrow will focus on reporting global conflicts and stuff. What we're going to do this evening is we're going to kick off at 5 o'clock with a legacy of conflict. And I'll be talking to a colleague of mine, Steve Crump. Now, Steve's the founder of Deaf Kids International, that works with deaf and deafened children and young people and adults around the world, but in some really challenging, low-resource settings, particularly around conflict zones, and go places where other people won't go to ensure that young people are being helped and looked after. So we're talking about working in a lot of refugee camps as well in places like Jordan and Iraq. Steve's previous roles have included being the head of comms for MAG, the Mines Advisory Group. So a lot of experience of trying to communicate with people sort of 20 odd years ago around mine clearance and the impact of demining. So really that kind of legacy of conflict, people still being injured in 2020 by mines that have been left through conflicts all over the world, is still quite great. And one of his previous roles as well, he was actually in Sarajevo with the International Red Cross, and has got some really interesting stories of people that he met there as well, particularly a group of brothers that were making pop art, quite a sort of interesting concept, which he as his way of supporting them, he actually bought and brought back. So he's still got some of those pieces. So hopefully we'll do an exhibition of them here at some point in the Dot Media Centre. Then at 6 o'clock we're going to be talking about the United Nations and peacekeeping, both military peacekeepers, which we tend to know about, probably most famously through Black Hawk Down, but also the role of the United Nations police officers as well, and particularly the rising important role of women as in that kind of police peacekeeping as well, particularly when it comes to some of the situations where women are nervous about talking to men, even though if they're police officers, because of their experiences, actually the UN's having great success when it comes to women police officers serving. And of course the great thing about it is you've got nearly 1 million men and women since 1948 when the United Nations started actually answering the call and serving with the blue berets or the blue helmets. Okay, so that's the United Nations, and I'm going to be talking to Mark Charlton from De Montfort University also about the role of Sustainable Goal 16, about peace and justice and strong institutions, and what kind of role that has going forward to 2030 when it comes to things like peacekeeping and helping people to put together organisations that can actually help people on the ground in those countries. Okay. Then at 7 o'clock, I'm going to be talking to Paul Riley about the Troubles. A lot of research that he's done around Northern Ireland, particularly through the parades, and he's got a really interesting project that he's completed now around Instagram, a hashtag called The Troubles, and 100 photographs that he's found on that as well. So I pulled out a few photographs, and so is he, out of that 100 that we're going to have a look at and have a conversation about maybe how it links with other things it reminds us of as well. This was done between September and December last year with the anniversary of the Troubles starting. So looking forward to that conversation. That'll be quite interesting. Then at 9 o'clock, we're going to be talking about alternative conflict reporting. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about graphic novels, animation, people creating content themselves, maybe virtual reality, a lot of stuff now where you get 360 tours of camps and tours of conflict zones and war-torn areas. and how can we report conflict in a slightly different way, not to make it more interesting, but maybe make it more accessible. And particularly, there's one in there as well about how research is being used, like Google Earth, weather data, photographs, and also Facebook posts that have been put up by soldiers as a way of showing off, is being used to date something and to prove that they were wearing a certain uniform that their government said that they weren't. So that's quite an interesting one as well. We'll be talking about those things. Then at 10 o'clock, we're talking about borders and the role that borders play, particularly this interesting concept of the walled West that I've discovered, where they say that the West, basically the global North, is basically a gated community. So between the border between Mexico and America, the border around Western Sahara, the border around Israel, and as you start going across the Middle East up through Europe, and then also north of Australia to Indonesia, basically the security apparatus that operates there and the amount of money that's spent on it is deliberately designed to keep the global south out, which is a really interesting concept and one that I'm quite looking forward to looking at. And obviously things like borders, they tend to be quite interesting because we're going to be talking to obviously Paul about the Troubles, North and Southern Ireland. We'll also be talking about things like Gaza and the West Bank, and Palestine, Kashmir, lots of border conflict, particularly in Western Sahara as well, with a Polisario front. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. 11 o'clock, we're talking about Afghanistan. I've called it the forever conflict because a lot of people don't realise, it seems to be going on forever, not just the one since 9/11, but also over the last 200 years, really where the great game played out between the Empire, the British Empire, and obviously the Russian Empire and various other empires as well, all through the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush, immortalised in many pieces of literature. So that's going to be an interesting one to have a conversation about. And then through the night, we're going to be trying to do something every hour on the hour for sort of 15, 20 minutes. And so we're going to be talking to Dodge Billingsley at 1 a.m, 6 p.m. his time in Salt Lake City about his experiences as a conflict reporter. So that includes Iraq, Afghanistan, Chechnya, the books that he's written about some of those experiences and the films that he's made and the awards that he's won as well, and how that kind of shapes his view of the world and what he's interested in, and maybe the role that his faith plays in that as well, with his commitment to going off and capturing some of these stories and working with some of these NGOs, particularly an NGO he's working with at the moment in Mali, which I'll be covering later on in the evening, about West Africa, which is the new front line now for Islamic fundamentalism when it comes to Daesh and IS. That'll be our new Iraq, and Afghanistan going forward will be in Western Africa, so Sahara and the Sahel area. And also talking a little bit about his interest that he's had with a documentary called The Unfortunate Brothers, which is about North and South Korea and that relationship, because that war, 1950 to 53 with the United Nations, still isn't at peace. So in fact, it's probably one of the world's longest running conflicts because it's still in that sort of quasi, there's been a ceasefire, but there's never ever been a treaty to finish it, which makes it quite interesting. Then from 3 till 5, I've got a media and research resources. So the content that we've put on there is for people to look at, lots of information, interesting thing about live feeds when it comes to maps, documenting content around that's been captured when it comes to attacks, bomb attacks, rocket attacks, things like that, all done in real time, that you can follow different areas of the world to see what the conflicts are at the moment. So there's a feed on the right hand side of a lot of these screens now when it comes to Twitter, using other pieces of social media, and AI brings it all together so you actually get a live idea in real time of what's going on in some of these areas. So some interesting stuff there. At 5 a.m. is the West Africa one. We'll be talking about that, the new front line. 6 a.m. is an interesting one because it's state-sanctioned crime. A lot of stuff that's done now by governments involving de facto use of mercenaries in order to carry out some of the stuff that they do. So a government's not committed to fighting in a country, but it uses its former soldiers, mercenaries, for a want of a better term, to go back with some very highly paid contracts in order to do the work as a private military contractor that the government would normally do. So again, that's quite an interesting concept. For a long time, was always seen very much as an American concept as well, with Blackwater, the problems they had in Iraq, where I think it got to the point where US military personnel and private contractors, by the end of the pull-out in Iraq, it had gone the other way. Again, a lot of those guys returning from their military service, leaving to much higher paid contracts to go back to Iraq. But also the role of a company called Wagner, which is basically a Russian private military contractor as well. And it's very difficult to see where the lines divide between official government, Russian government policy and that of this particular private military company. So that's quite an interesting one. 7 o'clock, why do people take up arms? I'm fascinated by this. Why do people go off and fight with the YPG or YPJ or Peshmerga against IS in Iraq or Syria? And then think about why people went off and fought for the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War. What motivates someone to do that, as much as someone that's radicalised through the internet and then goes off and actually joins IS or Daesh themselves. So it's really interesting what makes people take up arms, particularly those that have no formal military training, and get themselves involved. You can understand a little bit someone who's had some military training, then leaves and goes off and joins an organisation like that. So that's quite an interesting one. And then at 8 o'clock, we've got women reporting conflict. We had a really interesting reportage club a few weeks ago with Coulson, and we were talking about the role of 7 women in particular for International Women's Day, about women reporting conflict back to World War II and just before, Gerda Taro from covering the Spanish Civil War, and the groundbreaking role that a lot of these women had when it came from the first person to win a World Press Photo Award, or whether it's the first combat photographer to jump into Vietnam with a military unit. A lot of these women were groundbreaking in the work that they did, and single-minded in their determination in order to push things forward. So that's an interesting one as well. 9 o'clock, we'll be talking about reporting global conflicts. Maybe some of the famous names that people will have known or have seen, but also a little bit about some people that are kind of proactive now that maybe you can follow on social media, talking about the different types of conflicts that they're covering all over the world. Basically, the world's full of conflict at the moment. It might not be any big wars, but there's certainly lots of conflict going on. And then from 10 o'clock till 12, we're talking about the human cost. So we've got... At 10 o'clock, we're going to be talking to Rupal Rajani, who's a BBC Radio Leicester broadcast journalist. And she was 2 when she came over in 1972 from Uganda. So her parents and her siblings and herself at 2 arrived in Leicester after being expelled by Idi Amin. So we'll be talking about that, but also linking it to modern day forced expulsions when it comes to the Rohingya and stuff. And then at 10:30, I'm going to be talking to Sarah Riley. Looking forward to that. She's a disability rights advocate, an activist, and also a researcher, talking about the impact of conflict on women and girls in particular when it comes to disabilities. Not necessarily disabilities at the beginning, but certainly after the conflict, caused by scenarios like rape, for example, or through losing limbs. So we're talking about prosthetics, and then things like, Deaf Kids International is an interesting one, talking to Steve at 5, where it's about the impact now on the loss of hearing due to explosions and stuff in places like Syria. And then at 11 o'clock, we're going to be talking to Amber Rondell, who's a former DMU media production student, and John Hawker. And Amber's made a documentary with the family friend John, who was actually at the Twin Towers during 9/11, and she films him going back, talking about what his experiences were. And we're going to be talking to them live as well, so it'd be nice to find out a little bit more from John, some of his experiences, and maybe from Amber about how do you make a documentary like that? What do you decide to leave out? And then 12 till 2, we're talking about genocide. So at 12 o'clock, we've got Julian Harrison on, talking about his book, Suspended Disbelief, about the Holocaust, but also some of the things that he's done, journeys back to Eastern Europe while researching the book and other projects that he's been doing. And also he's got a new book in the pipeline about hidden Nazi architecture in sort of everyday life at the moment in Germany. It's still there, maybe it's just kind of hidden a little bit, and that's quite an interesting concept. And then at 12:45 we're going to be talking to Rob Watson. Rob and I went to Cambodia a couple of times 2 years ago. On one of those trips we were very fortunate to be invited to speak to the staff team at S21, the infamous Chul Sleng Genocide Museum, about how they use social media, but also about what they need to do in order to fight that Disneyfication of remembrance, of memory. It's a really interesting one because a lot of people turn up in t-shirts and singlets and shorts because they're doing the Southeast Asia trip. But, is that very respectful when it comes into somewhere where 14,000 people were ultimately, put to death and then went off to, to the killing fields, the link with the killing fields? And how do you look at things like AI or augmented reality or virtual reality when it comes to these places so that you make them more interesting, terrible way of describing it, more interesting for people to go to, beyond the very famous black and white photographs that are on display, and a lot of people will recognise some of those images. So that was a really interesting one. I'm looking forward to catching up with Rob about what his memories were of our trip and what kind of impact that's had on him as well. And then at 1:30 we're going to be talking to Kim Sadek, another colleague of mine from De Montfort University, who is the chair of the Remembering Srebrenica East Midlands Board, and her trips to Bosnia as well, and to Srebrenica in particular. And in July it's the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, genocide. So we'll be talking to about a couple of documentaries that I found online, and also how you link that learning with visits to Auschwitz, the Holocaust, and also maybe Rwanda, and also where Rob and I visited the Chul Sleng Genocide Museum. And then for the final section, the memories section, we're going to be talking to, again, another DMU colleague, Ben Archer, about his late father, Peter Archer, a very well respected and well known UK military artist, about the role that he played in capturing some of these memories and bringing them to life, but also the research that he would do before he painted these photos. Incredible level of detail and research that he would do. He just wouldn't just reproduce what someone said, or an imaginary version of it. Is probably quite historically accurate. So I'm quite interested from that concept about how that fits with documentary. And then to finish off, we're talking to a 9-year-old called Erin about what she learned at primary school just before the lockdown when it comes to World War II. If we look forward to next Friday, which is going to be the 75th anniversary of the victory in Europe, so bank holiday's been moved from Monday to next Friday. As we think about that, I think it's really important to note that since 2014, the government has not made the learning of World War II compulsory in the national curriculum, but a lot of primary schools are still doing it, particularly around the impact of the home front and children being evacuated and stuff. So I'm interested to find out what she's learnt from what she's done at primary school, and also reflect on why it is important that we still learn about the relationship that we've got with Europe, particularly sort of the whole Brexit scenario we've had over the last 3 years. Maybe learning more about Europe and the importance, and maybe what happened 75 years ago would made adults view Europe slightly differently. Would it have changed the context? And I'm here with my colleague Jurian, who's supporting me doing the tech. And Jurian's from Holland, so he's brought some items in from his granddad. I've got some items in from my granddad. It's memories, so we're going to be talking about the role that remembrance through grandparents maybe that have survived that time, but also through grandparents that have died. So, my name's John William, and it's James Costa. So John and William, I never met them. They were both killed during the war. But, that has an impact on both of my parents, and that's had an impact on my parents' families and their siblings as well. And so we talk about that really. So I think, next Friday, 75th anniversary VE Day, it's not about celebrating anything. It's about commemorating the people that came before us and, the sacrifices that a lot of people made. And of course, we can't not do that without mentioning Captain Tom, or is it Colonel Tom now? I think he's been promoted, raising about £30 million. Interesting, isn't it, that they're going to make a documentary about his life, and he served in Burma, otherwise called the Forgotten Army, the British Army that served out there. So actually the documentary they make about him, a lot of people will probably realise it wasn't all about D-Day, and then going on to Berlin, there was a lot of other stuff going on as well over in the Far East. The sacrifice that someone's made, and maybe that kind of generational learning between Captain Tom and VE Day and the Conflict Reportage Newsroom maybe will make a bit of a difference. Who knows? It's a bit of fun. Please get in touch. Feel free to email us, send us a message through Facebook, follow us on Twitter. If you go onto the website, conflictreportage.wordpress.com, for each of those 16 sections, there's a blog post that I've put together. And under that, there's some suggestions of film, photography, audio, and new media that you can look at. I'm not expecting you to go away and look at it all the time and ask you any questions. Once I've found out who's been watching, test you out. It's more of a resource going forward as well. We'll keep adding to it what we've found tonight. Obviously, we're Facebook Living, so we'll keep this. We've got various other recordings that are going on. Any observations and comments that Durin and I have and that you share with us, or any links, information, we'll add those to the blog posts. And hopefully at the end of it, when we get to 4 o'clock tomorrow, which I'm sure we will get to, it will be about the fact that we've created a really interesting resource that we can then build on, either to do again or to research further. So thank you very much for joining us. I can't believe I've just spoke for 28 minutes. That wasn't too bad, was it? Totally unscripted. It's dominated my life for the last 6 weeks. I particularly want to thank Paul and Sarah, who have been very helpful. 3 o'clock every Wednesday afternoon in lockdown, listening to me prattling on about this and being up for talking to me later and tomorrow. Rob Watson as well, as supportive as ever. Tina's at home doing all socially distanced, at home doing all of the social media for us. So that's really good. Durian. And one final thing, I just want to say that a good friend of everybody's passed away recently, Kev Ryan from Charnwood Arts. Really sad to hear that Kev had passed away, not of COVID-19, something else. And he was very instrumental in introducing me to Majid Saeed, whose photographs from Afghanistan we had here as an opening. But also we've had twice before, once at the Watt Space in the High Cross and also at one of the military history lives we had at Adult Education. So I put this poster here in memory of Kev. That'll be there throughout the 24 hours. Sad to see him go. My final point on that is I think we get immortality wrong. Immortality is not about individuals living forever. It's about, have you done anything that makes you be remembered after you've gone? And I'd like to think that Kev was the best of us. So thanks very much for watching. Please get in touch and look forward to interacting with you throughout the 24 hours at whatever point you want to join us. So thanks very much. Okay, got any questions? Send them to us.
Yeah, there was one question from Malcolm who asked if they can't watch it live on Facebook, where can they watch will it be recorded, the sessions?
Yeah, all the sessions are being recorded separately. And what we're going to do is we'll probably put each of those into the blog posts. So at the end of the 24 hours, we should have 15, 20-minute clips from each of the conversations with people. And then once we've filmed a little bit, then the conversation will carry on through Facebook Live rather than just recording everything. Maybe just we'll ask one person a really good question at the beginning, a good meaty question that we can capture for sort of 10, 15, 20 minutes. And that's what we'll put up. But the rest of the time, it'll just be through Facebook Live. And feel free to ask any questions as well that comes up in that conversation, or something, maybe something you've wanted to know about as well, about a conflict, about, why did this happen? How did that start? The fascinating thing is the more we learn from history, hopefully we won't repeat those mistakes, but, never again was said after the First World War. Which of course was called the Great War rather than the First World War, because we didn't know there was going to be a second one. So, oh, the irony. And also things like, never again when it comes to things like the Holocaust. And of course, genocide has happened, maybe not on that scale, but certainly several times since. So I think the more that we can have these conversations, and particularly interested in talking to Erin tomorrow as a 9-year-old, what she's learnt from World War II, because a lot of history tends to be about personalities, facts, figures, who started it, when it ended, how many people died. It then just becomes irrelevant. There's no connection, there's no reason for being interested in it, and certainly a lot of people don't see how that makes an impact on people's lives. So I think, the value of education when it comes to that is important. So this resource will be there afterwards. Feel free to use it. But again, ask some questions. One of the things I learned as well in doing the research for all of this is a lot of the times that we think who started the war, any conflict, is invariably not true, because it's normally used by the victor as a justification to start it. So again, quite a few large wars like that started as well. So it's going to be interesting. See what happens. Thank you.